My name is Maya Mitchell. I'm 29 years old, and I need to tell you about the Christmas Eve that changed everything. The night my mother looked me straight in the eyes, in front of everyone we knew, and whispered words so cold they still make my hands shake when I think about them. You ruined our lives. For years, I'd been the family's emotional punching bag, the convenient scapegoat for every failure, every disappointment, every uncomfortable truth they refused to face. But what I did next, how I finally responded after decades of silence, shocked everyone in that room, including myself. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. You're probably wondering how a mother could say something so devastating to her own daughter on Christmas Eve, right? Well, let me take you back to where it all started, because this wasn't just about one cruel sentence. This was about a lifetime of being treated like I was the problem, like my very existence was somehow a burden too heavy for them to carry. I'd spent 29 years trying to earn a place at a table where I should have been welcomed unconditionally, and that night, standing in my childhood living room, surrounded by fake smiles and forced holiday cheer, I finally understood the truth. If this story is hitting close to home, hit that subscribe button and drop a like. You're going to want to see how this unfolds. The thing about being the family scapegoat is that it happens so gradually. You don't even realize you're drowning until you're gasping for air. Every family gathering became a test I never asked it. Every conversation a minefield where one wrong word could trigger an avalanche of blame. And Christmas? Christmas was the annual championship of emotional warfare, wrapped in tinsel and served with a side of passive-aggressive commentary. But that particular Christmas Eve, something inside me finally snapped. Not in anger, but in clarity. And what happened next would rewrite the entire story of my life. The moment those words left her mouth, time seemed to stop. My mother, Linda, stood there with her perfectly manicured nails digging into my forearm, her voice low enough that only I could hear the venom, but her eyes loud enough for everyone to see the contempt. You ruined our lives. Not our family or this Christmas, our lives, plural, past tense, permanent. It was the kind of statement that doesn't just hurt. It rewrites your entire history, making you question every memory, every moment you thought was love. I'd heard criticism before, felt the sting of her disapproval more times than I could count, but this was different. This wasn't about something I'd done wrong or a mistake I'd made. This was about my existence itself being the problem. Around us, my Aunt Carol was laughing at something my cousin Brandon said, completely oblivious to the assassination happening 3 feet away. My father, Robert, was pouring wine like nothing was wrong, because in our family, pretending everything was fine was more important than actually fixing anything. The Christmas tree lights twinkled cheerfully in the background, mocking the darkness of what was unfolding. But here's what nobody expected, least of all me. I didn't cry. I didn't apologize. I didn't do that thing I'd done 1,000 times before where I twisted myself into knots trying to figure out what I'd done wrong and how I could fix it. Instead, I felt something I'd never felt before in that house, a strange, powerful calm washing over me like ice water. My heart was pounding, my hands were trembling, but my mind was suddenly, startlingly clear. And in that moment of perfect clarity, I understood that this wasn't the beginning of my worst Christmas. It was the beginning of my freedom. Let me paint you the full picture of what Christmas had always meant in my family. It wasn't about joy or celebration or togetherness. It was a performance, a carefully choreographed show where everyone played their assigned roles. My mother was the director, my father the silent enabler, my older brother Jason the golden child who could do no wrong. And me? I was the understudy nobody wanted but everyone needed when something went wrong. Every year I'd show up with gifts I couldn't afford, wearing a smile I didn't feel, hoping this would be the year they'd finally see me as worthy. The annual Christmas Eve dinner at my parents' house in suburban Connecticut was always the same brutal recipe. Forced cheerfulness, backhanded compliments disguised as concern, and an underlying current of judgment so thick you could cut it with a knife. My mother would spend weeks planning the perfect menu, the perfect decoration, the perfect Instagram-worthy tablescape, while simultaneously dropping hints about how much easier her life would be if I just tried harder or made better choices. My brother Jason would arrive with his picture-perfect wife Emma and their 2 adorable kids, and I'd watch as my parents lit up in ways they never did when I walked through the door. That particular Christmas Eve, I'd arrived early to help set up, desperately hoping that being useful would somehow earn me a moment of warmth. I spent 3 hours in the kitchen preparing side dishes while my mother critiqued everything from my knife skills to my outfit choice. Is that really what you're wearing, Maya? It's Christmas, not a funeral. I smiled through it all, swallowed the hurt, Told myself it would get better once everyone arrived. But what I didn't know yet was that I was walking into the most important night of my life, the night I would finally stop auditioning for a role I was never going to get. Being the family scapegoat wasn't something that happened overnight. It was a slow, suffocating process that started long before I had words to describe it. I was maybe 7 or 8 when I first noticed that when my brother Jason broke something, it was an accident. But when I did, it was carelessness. When he got a B on a test, my parents reassured him that he'd do better next time. But when I brought home anything less than an A, I got lectures about wasting my potential and disappointing them. The message was clear even then. His mistakes were forgivable, mine were character flaws. I learned early that love in my family wasn't unconditional. It was something you had to earn, and the price kept changing. As I got older, the pattern became more sophisticated but no less painful. When my parents' marriage hit rough patches, somehow it was because I was too difficult or too demanding as a teenager. When my father's business struggled, it was because he'd spent too much money on my college tuition. Never mind that Jason's Ivy League education cost 3 times as much. When my mother felt unfulfilled in her life, it was because raising me had been so exhausting that she never had time to pursue her own dream. I became the convenient answer to every question they didn't want to face about themselves. Before I go any further, make sure you're subscribed because what happens next reveals just how deep this betrayal goes. And drop a like if you've ever felt blame for things that weren't your fault. The worst part wasn't the blame itself, it was how I internalized it. By the time I was in my 20s, I genuinely believed I was the problem. I apologized for existing, for taking up space, for having needs. I worked myself to exhaustion trying to prove I was worthy of basic kindness. I chose careers based on what would make them proud, dated people they approved of, lived my entire life trying to become the daughter they could finally love. And you know what? It was never enough, because the truth I couldn't see yet was that they didn't need me to be better. They needed me to be wrong. My failure was essential to their story about why their lives hadn't turned out the way they wanted. By 6 o'clock, everyone had arrived, and the house was filled with that particular kind of noise that families make when they're performing happiness. My Aunt Carol and Uncle David came with their son Brandon, who'd just gotten engaged and couldn't stop talking about wedding. Jason and Emma swept in like royalty, their kids immediately becoming the center of attention, while my mother cooed over them like they were the second coming. I stood in the corner of the living room, holding a glass of wine I didn't really want, watching the scene unfold like I was observing it through glass. The dining room table looked like something out of a magazine, my mother's pride and joy. White linens, gold-rimmed china, crystal glasses catching the candlelight, a centerpiece of winter roses that probably cost more than my rent. Everyone took their assigned seats, the same configuration we'd had for years. My parents at the heads of the table, Jason and his family on one side, me squeezed between Aunt Carol and Cousin Brandon on the other. It was a physical manifestation of the family hierarchy, and my place in it had always been clear. As my mother brought out the first course, she was all smiles and grace, playing the role of perfect hostess while I tried to make myself smaller, quieter, less likely to trigger whatever criticism was inevitably coming. The conversation flowed in predictable pattern. Jason's recent promotion, Brandon's engagement, Emma's volunteer work at the kids' school. I contributed when asked direct questions, kept my answers brief and pleasant, laughed at the right moments, complimented the food. But I could feel my mother's eyes on me, that particular gaze she had that seemed to catalog every tiny imperfection. When I reached for the breadbasket, she made a small sound, not quite disapproval, but close enough that I withdrew my hand. When I mentioned my recent project at work, she changed the subject within 30 seconds. It was death by 1,000 small cuts, and everyone at that table had become so accustomed to it that they didn't even notice the blood anymore. It started, like it usually did, with something that sounded like a joke. We were halfway through dinner when my cousin Brandon looked at me and said, with a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes, "You always run late, don't you, Maya?" Some things never change. The table chuckled politely, and someone clinked a fork against a glass. My face grew hot, even though I had arrived early and spent hours helping in the kitchen. That didn't matter. The old story about me being irresponsible, disorganized, a screw-up, that was more familiar, more comfortable for them than the truth. I laughed weakly and said, "Actually, I was here before everyone else," but my voice sounded small, like even I didn't believe myself. Jason smirked into his wine, and Aunt Carol shook her head with that exaggerated, playful disappointment people use when they think they're being harmless. Nobody said, "That's not fair," or "Maya was the first one here." They just let the moment sit there, another brick in the wall of who I was allowed to be in this family. My mother gave a tiny shrug and muttered, "You know how she is," like it explained everything. If this kind of joke feels familiar, hit subscribe and leave a like. No one should grow up thinking casual cruelty is normal. The thing about comments like that is they don't live and die in a single moment. They pull up every memory of every time you were blamed, dismissed, or humiliated, and stack them all on your chest at once. I could feel my heart racing, my appetite disappearing as my brain started cataloging the time I was late once in high school, and it became my permanent label, the time I lost my keys, and it became a running joke for years, the time a real emergency made me miss a family event, and I was called selfish for weeks. Brandon's comment wasn't new. It was just the latest echo of a script they'd all agreed on, and I had no idea that this harmless jab was just the warm-up for something far more vicious. It happened between the main course and dessert, right when everyone was relaxed and a little buzzed from the wine. My mother was topping off glasses when she glanced at my empty plate and said, loudly enough for the table to hear, "You barely ate anything, Maya. Are you going to start something tonight too?" Her tone was light, but her eyes were sharp. I shook my head and mumbled, "I'm fine, Mom," trying to keep the peace like always. That should have been the end of it. But it wasn't. She stepped closer, her hand suddenly clamping down on my arm, nails digging into my skin through the fabric of my dress. She leaned in, her face inches from mine, and in a low, steady voice that somehow sliced through all the background chatter, she said, "You ruined our lives." For a second, I thought I'd misheard her. The words didn't make sense, like hearing your own name in a language you don't speak. Then they landed all at once, heavy and suffocating. My chest tightened, my ears started ringing, and the room seemed to tilt slightly. No one else at the table reacted, but I could feel my world splitting cleanly into two parts, before that sentence and after. Before I go on, make sure you're subscribed and tap like if you've ever had someone you love say something that you can never unhear. In that moment, it wasn't just about Christmas or dinner or some argument from the past. It felt like she was reaching back through every year of my life, taking every struggle, every misstep, every moment I'd needed help or understanding, and rewriting it as proof that I was a curse. Memories flashed through my mind like a cruel slideshow. Her crying when I changed my major in college, her shouting when I moved into my own apartment, her silent treatment when I said no to a loan I couldn't afford to get. "You ruined our lives," was the final verdict, the sentence she'd been building toward for decades. And as the words echoed in my head, something inside me didn't just break, it woke up. For as long as I could remember, my default response to pain in this family was to fold, apologize, make excuses, promise to do better, try harder, be less of whatever they said was too much. I'd cried at dinner tables before, locked myself in bathrooms to sob quietly so I wouldn't ruin the evening, stayed up all night replaying conversations to figure out where I went wrong. But standing there with my mother's nails still pressed into my arm and her words hanging in the air like poison, I felt something completely unexpected. Not tears, not shame, clarity. A cold, crystalline clarity that cut through 29 years of fog. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't make a scene. I just looked at her, really looked at her. And for the first time in my life, I saw her clearly, not as the mother I desperately needed her to be, but as a woman who had spent decades using me as a dumping ground for her own disappointment. I gently removed her hand from my arm, and in a voice so calm it surprised even me, I said, "Then today I stopped trying to save what was never mine to fix." The room went silent. My father froze with his wine glass halfway to his lips. Jason's fork clinked against his plate. Even the kids stopped fidgeting. Nobody had ever heard me speak like that before. Firm, final, free. My mother's face went through a series of expressions I'd never seen before. Shock, confusion, then something that looked almost like fear. She opened her mouth to say something, probably to backtrack or turn it into a joke or make me the villain for overreacting. But I was already standing up. I wasn't angry. I wasn't crying. I was just done. "Excuse me," I said to the table, and I walked toward the coat closet with legs that felt strangely steady. Behind me, I could hear whispers starting, "What's wrong with her? She's being dramatic." But for the first time in my entire life, I didn't care. Their narrative about me was no longer my prison. I grabbed my coat from the closet, my hands moving on autopilot while my mind raced with a strange mixture of terror and exhilaration. My mother called after me, her voice taking on that tone she used when she was trying to regain control. "Maya, don't be ridiculous. We're about to have dessert." But I didn't turn around. I didn't explain. I didn't give her the chance to twist this into another story about my failures. I just opened the front door and stepped out into the freezing December night, leaving behind the warmth, the lights, the whole suffocating performance of family togetherness. The cold air hit my face like a slap, but it was the most honest thing I'd felt all evening. My breath came out in white clouds as I stood on the front porch, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. From inside, I could hear muffled voices. My father saying something, my mother's defensive tone rising, Jason probably trying to smooth everything over like he always did. But out here, in the dark and the cold, there was just silence. No judgment, no expectation, no invisible scorecard tracking every breath I took. I started walking toward my car, and with each step I felt lighter, like I was shedding layers of invisible weight I'd been carrying for so long I'd forgotten what it felt like to stand up straight. I sat in my car for a long moment before starting the engine, watching the warm glow from the windows of my childhood home. Through the dining room curtains, I could see silhouettes moving around, life continuing without me, and I realized something profound. They would be fine. The dinner would go on, the presents would be exchanged, the family photos would be taken. My absence wouldn't ruin anything because I was never essential to their happiness. I was just essential to their dysfunction. As I pulled out of the driveway, I wasn't running away. I was walking towards something I'd never had before, the permission to put myself first. And that freezing December air felt warmer than any holiday gathering ever had. The first few days after Christmas were the hardest. I spent them alone in my small apartment, alternating between feeling powerful and feeling like the worst person alive. My phone kept buzzing with messages from family members, some angry, some confused, all of them framed around my behavior rather than what had actually been said to me. Jason texted, "You embarrassed Mom in front of everyone. What's wrong with you?" Aunt Carol called and left a voicemail about how I was tearing the family apart over nothing. Even my father, who almost never initiated contact, sent a brief message. "Your mother is very upset. You should apologize." I read each message and felt that familiar pull. That old instinct to explain myself, to justify, to make them understand. My fingers hovered over the keyboard a dozen times, drafting apologies I'd written 1,000 versions of before. "I'm sorry for overreacting. I didn't mean to make a scene. Can we just forget this happened?" But something was different this time. Every time I started to type those words, I heard my mother's voice in my head, "You ruined our lives." And I realized that no apology would ever be enough. Because the problem wasn't what I'd done. The problem was that I existed outside their control. Make sure you're subscribed, because what comes next is about choosing yourself over people who never chose you. And hit like if you've ever felt guilty for setting a boundary. By the third day, something shifted. I stopped reading the messages. I turned off my phone for hours at a time and just sat with the silence, really sat with it, instead of running from it like I always had. And in that silence, I started to hear my own voice for the first time in years. Not the voice that apologized reflexively or second-guessed every decision, but the voice that had been buried under decades of other people's expectations. That voice said something revolutionary. You don't owe them your pain. It said, abuse doesn't stop being abuse just because it's wrapped in tradition. It said, you're allowed to save yourself. And slowly, day by day, the guilt started losing its grip, replaced by something I'd never really felt before, self-respect. On New Year's Eve, while everyone else was celebrating fresh starts, I sat in my apartment and made a list. Not resolutions, but decisions. Real, concrete choices about the kind of life I wanted to build. At the top of that list, in bold letters, I wrote, I will never again live for people who only see me as a problem to solve. Underneath, I mapped out what that actually meant. No more loans I couldn't afford to give, no more holidays spent walking on eggshells, no more shaping my entire existence around earning love that should have been freely given. It sounds simple written out like that, but for me, it was like learning a completely new language. The biggest decision wasn't about my family at all, it was about myself. I'd been living in the same cramped apartment for years because it was good enough, working at a job that paid the bills, but slowly killed my spirit, dating people who were fine, but never quite right. All because I'd never believed I deserved better. I'd spent so much energy trying to be worthy in my family's eyes that I'd forgotten to ask what I actually wanted. So I made a choice that terrified me. I was going to rebuild my entire life from the ground up, starting with the one thing I'd never given myself. Permission to be selfish, to prioritize my own peace, to stop apologizing for taking up space. Within 2 weeks, I'd signed a lease on a tiny studio apartment across town. Nothing fancy, just 400 square feet and a view of a parking lot. But it was mine, completely, entirely mine. No family history soaked into the walls, no memories of criticism echoing in the hallway, no emotional landmines hidden in every corner. The day I moved in, I stood in the middle of that empty room with my few boxes of belonging, and I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Hope. Not the desperate, pleading hope that maybe this time they'll love me right, but the quiet, solid hope that comes from finally betting on yourself. That minuscule apartment became my launching pad. the place where I would learn who Maya Mitchell actually was when she wasn't busy being everyone's scapegoat. The first few months in my new apartment were a mix of freedom and disorientation. I'd spent so long living according to other people's scripts that I didn't even know what I liked anymore. What kind of music did I actually enjoy when I wasn't trying to impress anyone? What did I want to eat when no one was critiquing my choices? What made me happy when happiness wasn't measured by someone else's approval? These sound like simple questions, but for me, they were revolutionary. I started small, buying groceries I actually wanted, decorating with colors that made me smile even if they weren't sophisticated, staying up late, or waking up early based solely on what felt right to me. But I knew decorating and meal choices weren't going to heal decades of damage, so I did something I'd resisted for years. I found a therapist. Her name was Dr. Sarah Chen, and in our first session, when I tried to explain why I'd walked out on Christmas, I kept apologizing for taking up her time, for being dramatic, for probably overreacting. She stopped me gently and said, "Maya, you've just described years of emotional abuse, and you're apologizing to me for having feelings about it. Do you see the pattern?" That moment cracked something open in me. For the first time, someone with authority and expertise was validating what I'd always suspected but never dared to believe. I wasn't the problem. Therapy became my anchor as I rebuilt everything else. I started looking for a new job, not just any job, but one that aligned with what I actually cared about rather than what would make my parents proud. I took a risk and applied for a position at a nonprofit that worked with at-risk youth, something I'd always been passionate about but dismissed as not practical enough whenever I'd mentioned it at family dinners. When I got the interview, I was terrified. When I got the offer, I cried for an hour straight, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming realization that I was capable of so much more than I'd ever allowed myself to imagine. This was what it felt like to live for myself, and it was simultaneously terrifying and exhilarating. 6 months after that Christmas Eve, something incredible happened at my new job. I'd been working on a mentorship program for teenagers who'd aged out of foster care, and the project I'd designed got selected for a citywide implementation. My boss, Marcus, called me into his office and told me I was being promoted to program director. I sat there stunned, because for the first time in my life, someone was recognizing my abilities not despite who I was, but because of who I was. There was no caveat, no but, no suggestion that I'd gotten lucky or that someone else deserved it more. What made it even more powerful was realizing how much of my strength had been there all along, just buried under years of being told I wasn't enough. The organizational skills my mother called controlling, they made me an excellent project manager. The empathy my family dismissed as being too sensitive, it made me exceptional at connecting with traumatized kids who needed someone to actually see them. The resilience I'd built from surviving emotional abuse, it gave me the courage to advocate for vulnerable populations when others looked away. Every quality they'd convinced me was a flaw turned out to be exactly what made me good at my job, good at life, good period. Around the same time, I launched a side project I'd been dreaming about for years, but never had the confidence to pursue. I started a blog and podcast called Scapegoat Stories, where people could share their experiences with family dysfunction and find community with others who understood. Within 3 months, I had thousands of followers. People would message me saying, "I thought I was crazy," or "You just described my entire childhood," or "Thank you for making me feel less alone." I'd spent my whole life being told I was the problem, and now I was using that pain to help others realize they weren't broken. Their families were. That's when I understood. My mother was wrong. I hadn't ruined anything. I'd survived, and that survival was turning into something beautiful. It took them almost 8 months to realize I wasn't coming back. 8 months of me not showing up to birthdays, not responding to group texts, not performing my role as the family punching bag. At first, they seemed almost relieved. One less complication to manage, one less person to blame when things went wrong. But then something shifted. My mother started calling, leaving voicemails that began with irritation and slowly morphed into something that almost sounded like concern. "Maya, this has gone on long enough. You're being childish. Call me back." Then, "People are asking about you. You're making us look bad." Then, finally, "I don't understand why you're doing this to us." The messages from other family members followed a similar pattern. Jason texted, "Mom's really upset. Whatever you think happened, you need to get over it. Family is family." Aunt Carol sent a long email about how I was throwing away relationships over one bad night and how I'd regret this someday when it's too late. Even my father, who'd barely acknowledged my existence for years, suddenly wanted to have lunch and talk things through. But here's what was fascinating. Not a single person, not one, acknowledged what had actually been said to me. No one mentioned, "You ruined our lives." No one apologized. They just wanted me to come back and pretend it never happened, to resume my position as the family's emotional landfill. What they didn't understand was that my absence wasn't punishment or revenge. It was survival. They'd grown so accustomed to having someone to blame, someone to absorb their dysfunction, someone to make them feel better about themselves by comparison, that my absence created a void they didn't know how to fill. Without me there to criticize, they had to look at each other, at themselves, at the actual problems in their lives, and they hated it. So they tried every manipulation tactic in the book. Guilt, how can you do this to your mother? Obligation, after everything we've done for you. And eventually, desperation, we miss you. But I'd learned something crucial in therapy. People who truly love you don't need you to be small, broken, or wrong. They'd never missed me. They missed their scapegoat. Looking back now, almost a year later, I realized that my response to my mother on Christmas Eve wasn't actually the words I spoke in that dining room. The real response was everything that came after. It was choosing to rebuild my life on my own terms instead of begging to be let back into a system designed to diminish. It was the promotion I earned, the podcast I built, the community I created, the boundaries I enforced. Every single day I chose peace over performance was another word in my answer. Every morning I woke up in my little studio apartment and felt genuine contentment instead of dread was a sentence in my reply. My mother said I ruined their lives, but what I actually did was refuse to let them ruin mine. There's a huge difference between those two things, though it took me 29 years to see it. I didn't destroy their family. I simply stopped participating in a dynamic that required my suffering to function. I didn't abandon them. I stopped abandoning myself. And the truth is, they're probably fine. They've likely found new narratives to explain why things aren't perfect, new people to subtly blame, new ways to avoid looking at their own choices. But that's not my problem to solve anymore. And that realization is perhaps the greatest gift I've ever given myself. Today, I understand that breaking away wasn't an act of cruelty or revenge. It was an act of self-preservation and ultimately of self-love. I'm not angry at them anymore, which surprised me. Anger requires engagement, and I've simply disengaged. I hope they find peace. I hope they grow. I hope someday they understand what they did. But I'm not waiting around for that understanding anymore. My victory isn't in proving them wrong or making them sorry. My victory is this. I wake up every single day knowing that I am enough, exactly as I am, without earning it, without justifying it, without apologizing for it. And that knowledge, that bone-deep certainty that I deserve to exist without shame, is the most powerful response I could have ever given. So after hearing my story, I want to ask you something. What would you have done in my place? Would you have stayed and tried to make it work, hoping that one more attempt, one more conversation, one more year might finally change things? Or would you have walked out into that cold December night like I did, terrifying and liberating at the same time? I'm genuinely curious because I know everyone's situation is different, and I'm not here to tell you there's only one right answer. But I will tell you this. If you're living your life trying to earn love from people who treat your existence like a burden, you're not actually living. You're surviving, and you deserve so much more than survival. Here's my real take on this whole revenge and betrayal thing, and it might surprise you. Do I believe revenge ever truly brings peace, or does it just feed more anger? Honestly, I think real revenge isn't about making someone else suffer. It's about refusing to suffer anymore yourself. The sweetest revenge against people who tried to make you small is becoming exactly who you were meant to be without their permission. It's building a life so authentic, so fulfilling, so genuinely yours that their opinions become background noise you don't even register anymore. My mother tried to convince me I ruined their lives, but what I actually did was save my own. And if that makes me selfish, then I'll wear that label proudly. Was I wrong for what I did? For walking out on Christmas, for cutting contact, for choosing my peace over their comfort? Let me know in the comments because I genuinely want to hear your perspective. Maybe you think I should have tried harder, communicated better, given them more chances. Or maybe you've been exactly where I was, and you understand why sometimes the only winning move is not to play. Either way, your story matters, and I want to hear it. If you want more stories like this, real, raw, honest conversations about the complicated reality of family dynamics, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. Next week, I'm sharing a story about what happened when my brother finally reached out 6 months after I left. And trust me, you won't want to miss his reaction when he realized I wasn't coming back. Thank you for being here, for listening, and for reminding me that I'm not alone in this journey. I'll see you in the next video.